Hey everyone, this is Karen Allen from the Hub. Eugenie is sharing a sample of some of the lectures you might expect to find here on the Hub. The 90-minute lecture you're about to hear is the one prep session that everyone should have before they ever open the front cover of Samuel Hahnemann's Organon. Really, nobody should dive into that amazing book unprepared. And as you're listening, be sure to check the show notes to download some great reference docs. The Hub offers live and stream-on-demand training, connection, and inspiration for homeopaths around the globe. To find out more about us, drop by our website at www.trinityhealthhub.com and connect with us on Instagram and Facebook. We hope you enjoy this class. And if you are fascinated with homeopathy like we are, we look forward to seeing you online with us.
We're going to look at the era of enlightenment and how did that impact Hahnemann? How did we emerge into homeopathy as part of the era of enlightenment? We're going to look at what Hahnemann's training was and what his early life was that I think had a huge impact on him, on homeopathy, and on all of us as the Hahnemannian miasm. And then we're going to talk about how do you actually study a book that was written in 1828 and updated 5 times between then and the 1860s. And now here we are 160 years later, and we're trying to understand what the heck was he talking about? Am I the only one that ever wonders that? What the heck was he talking about? So we're going to go through some suggestions of how do we read historical documents, and then we're going to have some time for you guys questions. All right, so first of all, the Organon, it's not like reading modern fiction. And first of all, it was written in a different era where there were different ways of communicating, different languaging. And there have been a lot of translations. Now, how many of you, when you first started studying the Organon, actually learned from a different version than Wenda Brewster O'Reilly's? Wenda and I went through the first year of homeopathic school together in San Francisco. And some of you did. Can you type in the chat which version? I studied the Pendleton Naude translation. Abby, you guys used Wenda's, yeah. So Wenda went through the first year of homeopathic school with me, and her husband had a job that took him to Europe. And she went to study with Jeremy in England and talked to Jeremy about, what can we do about this book? And he said, go for it, girl. And so she partnered with somebody who could do translation with her, and they came up with this very modern translation that is great for our era. For many of us as homeopaths, that was not our first introduction to the Organon. So I'm getting a note that says that this is not broadcasting on Facebook Live. So let me make a change here. Oh, you went through Boraki's translation. Yes. So there are a lot of us that started with the Organon in all different kinds of translations that were written in multiple different eras. So we had what Hahnemann wrote between 1828 and 1860. And then we had someone else's translation of that with whatever they brought to it and their ideas about it. And so now most of us use this modern translation by Wenda. And you'll notice as you scan through the pages, there's a lot of words in there that are really unfamiliar. Now, in Wenda's version, she very specifically called out these unfamiliar words by putting them in italics. And she created a fairly extensive glossary in the back. But for a lot of us who started out with Boraki's translation or with, and William Boraki, do you guys know the story about how the 6th edition of the Organon came to the US? Hahnemann wrote the 6th edition of the Organon, where he introduced all of his work that he had developed in Paris, all of the LMs, all of that theory, and a lot more information about Sora that he wove through there, things from chronic diseases. And he felt that the homeopathic community was not ready for this. They wouldn't like it. They wouldn't accept it. And so at his last years, he told Melanie, I do not want you to publish this. Hold on to it until the homeopathic community is ready. And then he died. And Melanie didn't have a great relationship with the homeopathic community. They were a lot of male doctors. She was a woman in a time where that wasn't a very empowered position to take. And so it was kind of difficult for her. And for a while, it was rumored that there was this additional version of the Organon, but everybody was practicing from the 5th edition. And people didn't even know for sure, did it really exist, did it not? Melanie's ward, her adopted daughter, ended up marrying Benninghausen's son. And they kept this copy that Hahnemann had written of the Organon safe for a long time. And between them, they read it, they studied it, and they kept it quiet. Eventually, this was a time in the late 1800s and very early 1900s where Europe was not a very safe place to be. There was a lot of war going on and a lot of disruption. And eventually a message came to William Boraki, who was in San Francisco. And he and another colleague actually traveled to Germany to give Melanie money. By this time, she didn't have any money and had fallen on hard times. And the only thing of value that she had was Hahnemann's Organon. And she was afraid that it was going to be destroyed in a war-torn environment. And so they met in Germany. He met with Benninghausen's son and Melanie's daughter, and he got this copy of the Organon. And as they were coming back over to the US on a ship, they felt like they had this incredibly valuable thing. What if the ship should sink? What if? And so they copied out by hand copies while they were on the ship, copying the entire Organon so that if something happened, if they lost it, if the boat sank, if something, they would have these additional copies. And some of these are there now, along with the 6th edition of the Organon at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School Special Reference Library. That's how it ended up in there. Now, in those earlier translations, there are no glossaries because Boraki spoke German. Boraki wasn't that far removed. It was 60 years. If we think now it's 2020 now, most of us are able to reach back to what was happening in 1960 and understand the phrasing and language and unfamiliarity of that time. But not everybody can do that for 100 years or 160 years. So when Boraki was doing this translation in 1910, he still understood the terminology. It was still close enough. which is not the same for us 160 years later. And that's why Wenda needed to add a glossary. And how many of us actually had a problem with Hahnemann's communication style? Was that just me when I started reading the Organon? Does it seem like he does an inordinate amount of bashing and ranting and fussing and complaining and generally being cranky? He does. Okay, so some of that we have to say was just Hahnemann, but also some of that was the dominant, bombastic communication style of the early 1800s. And if you go read other things that were written in the 1830s and 1840s, they sound like that. And so in our politically correct environment, where you would be more likely to say, I see things differently than you are a stupid hazard to humanity, it doesn't read the same way, does it? So, not so good. All right. So the next challenge, the next obstacle for reading the Organon is that the concepts in it are disruptive for the current dominant paradigm that we have of biomechanical reductionist interpretation of health. Now, I come from 5 generations of MDs, and I definitely grew up with ideas of biomechanical views of health, where what the body is doing is because of biomechanical things in the body. I get sick because a germ comes in and makes me sick, without any awareness at all of the vital force, of susceptibility, of those kinds of things. And so as I read the Organon, there were ideas that were very hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I actually read the entire Organon as assigned my first year of homeopathic school. And I don't think I understood any of it. It wasn't until my 3rd or 4th or 5th or 10th time going through it that I began to understand, oh, actually this thing about the vital forces is kind of important. I was able to read it as words, but it just didn't soak in. Did this happen with anybody else? Or did you come across some part of it where you were reading and you think, yeah, that's not true? Or that's baloney, or what was he thinking? Or I don't understand this. Or that might have been true in the 1850s, but what about now? Yeah, Dot says it's very dry. Okay, so in our class, we're going to make it very juicy because it's fascinating. We just need a little help to open it up. Another part is that Hahnemann says things that are bullshit. Oh, I swore. Hahnemann says things that are baloney. He absolutely makes flat out statements that we know now are not true because science has moved on. He was working with the best of the scientific knowledge of his time. But now we know that they aren't true. Do we judge Hahnemann for being a man of his time? No. But for some people, there is this idea of, oh, well, if he said this and it wasn't true, then can I believe the rest of what's in the book? That a problem for anybody? Anybody else had some thoughts about that? Given what we know about Hahnemann, can we guess that if he was here, he would have updated that stuff out of the book? He would be reading this book and arguing with himself about it. Yep. Yeah, Deb says this has always been true. It's still true today. I heard a really interesting concept that kind of blew my mind this last week. I was watching a video from one of my mentors, Benjamin Hardy, who is a PhD in behavioral psychology. And he was talking about how we deal with our own personal past or our communal past. And he said, the truth is we think of the past as fixed. It happened and it's done. But in actual fact, We are continually reconstructing and rebuilding the past through the lens of our current view. And a perfect example is when we think our mom was a jerk until we get old enough to have children and we find ourselves saying the same thing to our kid that our mom said to us, and we go, oh, wow, now I understand. Or we learn some new thing which demystifies a part of our past. And so we are continually reconstructing the past, and we need to do this ourselves in our comprehension of the Organon. Okay, so let's focus in a little bit as we talk about this stream that brought us to homeopathy. We're going to focus in on what it is and what it isn't. And Hahnemann gives us a lot of governing principles, and we need to look at where does homeopathy apply and where does it not? What is the realm of homeopathy? And how did this come to be? We're going to look today at what were the influences around Hahnemann. What was his training? How did it impact his discoveries? What are the larger societal influences? There was a reason why homeopathy emerged at the time that it emerged. And it wasn't just Hahnemann. Oh, what was BS? Oh, in the Organon, there are some things where he talks about electricity, magnetism. There are a couple of different things that he talks about that are factually, that we know to be factually incorrect now. Not his theory and philosophy, not the methodology that he provides for homeopathy, but some of his scientific references are now outdated. That's the part that's baloney. Okay, so we talked about this diagram a little bit last night in the Stay Stellar session. So we've got what we think of as classical homeopathic care, chronic care. Hahnemann never used the term constitutional. He did acute and he did chronic. And what he meant by that was you take a case, you identify a characteristic pattern, you find a remedy that matches the totality of that characteristic pattern, you give a remedy, it's a single remedy in whatever potency, in some method that that person administers it, and then you monitor for response in dialogue with the vital force. That basically is what this center circle is all about. Now, surrounding that, we have things that are homeopath-ish. They're not the same as classic, chronic, or acute care. We have Bach flower remedies that are part of Dr. Bach's work, and he's the one who pioneered all the bowel nosodes. We have cell salts, Wilhelm Schussler's work, and there's remedies like clematis, that are a homeopathic remedy and also a Bach flower. There are remedies like mag phos that are homeopathic and also cell salts. There are remedies that are also medicines like digitalis, and we might give someone potentized digitalis after they took the medication and had a problem with it. And we also see in allopathic drugs that digitalis is out there in the world, glenoinum and nitroglycerin. These things are all happening in layers of refinement. Out here, we have iron supplements, and then we've got ferrum phos or ferrum arsenicum. And then we've got the homeopathic remedy, ferrum metallicum. These are on a continuum of potentization. Same thing here. And same thing with lesional therapeutics. We've got what's going on with classical homeopathy. And then we have therapeutics where we're dealing with the end products of disease. Maybe the chronic remedy that helps the person overall does not address this huge fibroid. And so we give a remedy that deals with the end products of the disease. And it's less sophisticated as a therapeutic than what's happening in here. And then there's also combination remedies. And again, those are a less sophisticated use of homeopathy. They allow more people to try homeopathy without having an expert knowledge of it. And for that reason, I'm glad. There are a lot of people who come to homeopathy because they try a combination remedy that does something amazing. And later they seek out a homeopath because of that. We have nosodes that we use. We have microflora that, you know, the nosodes like the bowel nosodes, the microflora like everything that we can think of now as the microbiome, which Hahnemann would have called sora. We've got organ support remedies and nutraceuticals and herbal tinctures and gemmotherapy. All of these are in the realm of homeopathy, from actual substance to slightly potentized to highly refined. This is the realm. And we use this for a wide variety of health complaints. And there are some things that we think, well, does that really apply? Do we use homeopathy in pathology of the eye? Or do we just say, oh, well, if your vision's declining, you just got to go get glasses? Well, how many of you know about Ed Condrat's work? He is an ophthalmologist and a very good, capable homeopath. And Berridge was an ophthalmologist in England and wrote a fantastic repertory just of the eye. Same thing with teeth. People have the idea that there's homeopathy for the whatever, but once it comes to your teeth, just go see the dentist. Well, these old homeopaths didn't have that option really. And so they charged in there and used homeopathy in all kinds of ways. In the polarity analysis class last Saturday, Tim Shannon was talking about how Benninghausen had a collection of 600 cured cases of epilepsy. The man was a prolific prescriber and documenter. 600 cases of epilepsy, cured cases of epilepsy. So there are a lot of these kinds of things that we don't use homeopathy for now, but in the past, in Hahnemann's day, they were being used. And Hahnemann worked at the level of mineral supplement and cell salts and refined remedies and herbs and flower essences and all kinds of things. The one things we can be sure he did not work with were combination remedies. And boy, did he have a chance to rant about those. All right, so let's talk about how this came to be. What is the backstory? The 30 Years' War happened in Europe starting in 1618 and ended in 1648, and it was horribly destructive. It was an extreme situation where armies marched in, marched through, destroyed crops, burned buildings, raped, pillaged, massacred again and again and again and again, to the point where people were starving and dying, and it was a horrible time in European history. And as Europe came out of that really dark time, the situation was so extreme that the intellectuals, the thought leaders of the day said, this thing of king and country, that sucks. And we're not willing to do that anymore. These crazy people who are running our world and just marching armies all over us, we're not doing this anymore. And we are not going to devote ourselves to warfare. And they began to buck tradition. They began to look for better solutions. And there was a lot of world exploration that was happening. This was a time when Columbus came to America. This was, he had come there, he had come back. Magellan had gone around the world. There were all kinds of reports coming back from various places showing us that the world was bigger than our little country, our little fiefdom. And there was a huge amount of interest in scientific study. And at this point, the average citizen said, I am no longer willing to be completely trampled by the church and by a monarch. And there was a huge explosion of criticism against church. This was a time when a lot of rebellion happened on every level. And it was like, this was the ultimate morbific influence for intellectual light to come into the world. So before the Enlightenment, basically we had Johannes Kepler, who was an amazing observer and scientist who had his whole theory of the spheres, and Galileo. And they were the ones who said, oh, this thing about the sun revolves around the earth, actually, that's not true. And Galileo proved it with his observations, and he got excommunicated from the church because of it. Descartes began to teach his ideas about res interna, the way I think things are, and res externa, the way they actually are. Francis Bacon began to look at how do we learn in science? And Isaac Newton, who was discovering all kinds of things in Oxford in 1687, he is deemed to have been the one who kicked off the publication of the era of enlightenment by writing his first Principles of Mathematics book in 1687. The result was that people started to prioritize reason and the evidence of the senses as opposed to blind loyalty and superstition. This is where we started to look at hypothesis, at observation, at experiment. What can we conclude? Let's use our minds. How can we refine? How can we do better instead of just exploiting and starving people to death? And this created a huge backlash in the religious community, and people got excommunicated, and there was a lot of debate. It became a very vivid time. In 1688 in England, the Protestant citizens overthrew King James II, who was a Catholic, and they put King William and Queen Mary on the throne. And these two were much more progressive. They were not into the oppressive, let's just tax and go fight wars approach to governance. And the English government under them ratified the Bill of Rights for citizens. Think about how amazing this was. It had not existed in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. And they began to publish newspapers, which meant that information was being disseminated. In the mid-1700s in France, they began to separate the powers of government functions, the way that in the US we've got the Congress, we've got the office of the president, we've got the courts. They began to implement some of that kind of strategy to make sure that one bad apple in a difficult setting could not wreak havoc for everybody. Voltaire began to write and publish. There began to be a very widespread and open dissent, which up to that point hadn't happened. If you said something against the king, they just killed you. And now that kind of commentary and satire was public. Another huge thing was the creation by Diderot of the encyclopedia, which was amazing. Remember how rare information, actual information, was in the 1400s, 1500s, early 1600s. How rare. Unless you happen to be wealthy or you were associated with a university that had a tiny library, or you were a monk, you probably had no access to a book of any kind at all. So, this was an era when dissemination of written information began to be available to a lot more people. And it was a time of incredible evolution in economics and law and industrial technology. This is where we are heading toward the Industrial Revolution. Humanitarianism, women's rights. It was, women up to this point were chattel. And at this point, that began to change. An incredible creation in music and in medicine. So let's see what's happening. Let's narrow this down now to Germany, to Hahnemann, because Hahnemann lived his entire developmental life in the era of Enlightenment. At this time, Germany wasn't the country of Germany that we think of now. Parts of it were Germany, parts of it were Prussia, but all of it was these little sort of tiny country states that had a local duke or a local king, and many of them were horribly corrupt. And they were not interested in an educated populace who could challenge them. They mostly just wanted people to farm the land and shut up and pay their taxes. So at that time, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the language everybody wrote in was Latin. So it was very hard to disseminate information. This was why this creation of this newspaper, wherever it was, in 1702, this is why it was so important. Publication was beginning to happen in the vernacular instead of in Latin. All right, so in Germany, unlike England, unlike France, unlike other places where they had gone through disastrous wars, there was not a discontent middle class. There were the serfs, there were the intellectuals, and there were the monarchs. And there wasn't an unhappy church. These were people who had kind of a good Protestant work ethic. There were not the same battles that were being fought elsewhere. And so the religious backlash to suppress scientific knowledge didn't exist here. This was really good for Hahnemann. So in Germany, the Enlightenment focused completely on science. Leibniz developed calculus. We already talked about these other things. The result was that there was a political unity that moved toward science in a big way. Now, up till this point, medicine was based on tradition and superstition. Have you guys heard of this idea of the four humors? Sanguine, choleric, what are the other two? Do you guys remember? This came from the Greek. And there was the idea that when you got sick, these humors were out of balance. Do you remember this? Phlegmatic and nervous, thank you. Melancholic, yeah. And they each had a color. I think choleric was black or sanguine was red or whatever. And it had no factual basis to it. There was, people did medicine based on, I throw a whole bunch of stuff, this formula, into a bottle and I give it to you and I say, take it. There was an extremely limited understanding of what was health even, what was hygiene. People didn't understand, germ theory didn't exist yet. Hahnemann did everything he did without knowledge of germ theory. And there really was not any idea of individualized therapeutics. Before the 1700s, there weren't even hospitals. At first, there were places, you know, if you were sick, you would go to like the local abbey where they might have somebody who did herbs, or you would, you know, go to the local witch and try and get something. But there really wasn't anything to deal with large, serious illness, epidemics, things like that. At first, hospitals were created by these aristocrats who were caught up in the humanitarian view of the Enlightenment. And later, it was run by governments who said, oh, actually, we can create a more loyal, healthy, productive, effective populace if we help them with healthcare. There is a public good in healthcare that benefits us, so we're going to create hospitals. Now, this same debate is still happening now. Is there a public good that impels us to help the citizenry be healthy, or is there not? Okay, so the emergence of hospitals depended on the Enlightenment. There was a change in attitudes of the public regarding healthcare. Up to this period, if you got sick, it was because you were cursed, or because evil spirits had gotten you, or something. And there was huge stigma about appearing sick, so you didn't let it show if you were sick. And during the Enlightenment, with the discovery of germ theory, people began to accept and teach concepts of hygiene. So the Enlightenment continued from about 1687 to about 1800. The US American Revolution was part of this Enlightenment change, where the US was not interested in being oppressed by a monarch. And all of the documentation about the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, which was written in 1787, contains all of this Enlightenment philosophy. So the pendulum swung way in this era of science. It's all about science and observation. And then it went back to feeling. And the Enlightenment era closed and was followed by the era of romance. And there was an Enlightenment skeptic, Immanuel Kant, who wrote this book called Critique of Pure Reason, where he said, look, there are no universal truths. And we can only experience anything through the subjective of the observer, which means the objective is not a concrete, inviolate thing. And actually, Immanuel Kant wrote this essay called Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment?, where he first used the term sapere aude, which is the term that Hahnemann took as his own personal byline of dare to know. Okay? As we got to the end of the 1800s, reason-based assertions started to be challenged, and there was more education in English, in local vernacular languages, and honestly, people found romantic ideas much more interesting and appealing than science ideas. Go figure. Still happens, doesn't it? Okay, are you guys with me so far? This is the era that spawned homeopathy, right? So why did it end? Well, we had the French Revolution. The French citizens said, we are done with the let them eat cake thing. And they were inspired by the Enlightenment philosophies, and they revolted, and they started beheading all of the aristocrats, and they started creating representative assemblies, and it was a huge mess in France. The aristocrats were trying to get out. Many of them immigrated or were smuggled to other countries. It was such a breakdown of normal convention that there was a conclusion at that point by those in power of this has now gotten out of control. We listened to their ideas about enlightenment, about humanism, about women have rights, about all that, and look at what happened. Now the world has gone to hell in a handbasket. And so it was deemed that these Enlightenment philosophies were not viable and that people were too stupid and unpredictable to govern themselves. That was what ended the Enlightenment era. So I just wanted to show you, this is Hahnemann's writing. For those of you who have been to San Francisco and had the opportunity to make an appointment there to see the actual Organon, and I recommend it highly to anybody, at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School up on Parnassus in San Francisco, you can make an appointment with the Special Collections librarian. And they actually have a whole version of the Organon that's online. I'll post the link of it so that you can go see every page of it. Hahnemann has this incredibly careful writing. And as you're sitting there looking at it, looking at all of his writing, you see that, oh, actually in the 6th edition of the Organon, there are other people who wrote stuff in there. Was it Hale? Was it Boricke? Was it Melanie? We don't know. We don't know who those other people's handwritings are. It would be a great PhD project for somebody who was interested in doing some stuff. Anyway, Hahnemann was a meticulous, careful guy. And for anybody who does handwriting analysis, power on. I just wanted to give you a this is what the entire Organon text looks like. Very small, very careful. Okay, so I always thought that homeopathy was Hahnemann's brainchild, that he by himself went through medical school, saw the horrible things that they were doing in that era, tried practicing medicine, realized he was killing people off because the therapeutics at that time were horrible. And we'll talk about LM potencies as we get later on, okay? Thank you, good question. And I always thought that Hahnemann thought up everything in the Organon himself. And as we look, we need to see that there is an awful lot of what was just happening in his medical training that he wrote down. And it wasn't him. He was a part of, he was lifted in the sea of many ideas of thought. And there is a very broad stream that fueled him, and it helps us to understand it. So Hahnemann's work, the entire thing of homeopathy, was part of the era of enlightenment. And there was a doctor, many of you will have read in the Homeopathic Materia Medica, references to Hufflin's journal. Hufflin practiced this journal, which it was very proudly stated that this was in the hands of every practicing physician. It was an incredibly popular journal. Before Hahnemann ever did anything, Hufflin started publishing things in his journal, talking about how important it was to train doctors in a practical form of medicine by the patient's bedside. And we're going to talk a little bit about what was medicine like in that era. And then Hahnemann had the amazing good fortune to go to school of Vienna, which was called the Modernist School, and to work with two amazing mentors, von Koen and von Sturck, who were incredible, and they both took Hahnemann under their wing and helped him. And they both emphasized that science should create a distinct pharmacopoeia where we look at each item individually and we identify what are the qualities of that item. This is what Hahnemann was taught in school, making dilutions of items and seeing what they do. He was taught this in school. He didn't make this stuff up. They also felt that we should be attending to the details of the sick person. So out of his training in that era, Hahnemann took on these goals that he had been taught in the School of Vienna. First of all, stop administering medicines without knowledge. If we take these 83 things and stick them in a pot and give it to somebody and say, take a spoonful every hour, we have no idea what's going on there. Stop that. Stop doing that. And secondly, learn the properties of the medicinal substances. And so there's a book that I want to recommend for all of you guys. It's called The Sources of Homeopathy. This was a doctoral dissertation by Corinne Muir, who is a wonderful gal in France who I met and gave me a copy of this book. I think that you can buy it I don't know if it's available. One of you guys can check and see on A-Libris or Amazon, or, can you find used copies? You can go look on worldbookcat.org or something like that. Highly, highly recommended. This may be available through Nirjana Verlag or Homeopathic Educational Services, or for those of you who are in other countries, you may be able to find it in other places. Highly recommended, okay? It was published by Boiron. So let's look at how Hahnemann was taught. And before we even get into this, I want to just say a little bit about the way that Hahnemann grew up. Hahnemann was born in 1755 in Meissen, which was sort of Germania, Bohemia, Austria-ish. He was born to an elite scientist, artist, who his father was a painter in a china factory. And porcelain at that time represented the highest art of what chemistry could do. It was very different than pottery. And it was seen as very refined, very elegant, and Meissen produced the best porcelain in the world at that time and became very famous and very elite. And Hahnemann's father was, they called him the painter. He was a chemist. He developed paints. He used them. He was very well respected in this little town. He got Hahnemann, who he recognized as being very bright, into the local school with schoolmaster Muller, who taught all the aristocrats' kids. And then bad stuff went down. There was a war, the 7 Years' War, that went from, I think, 57 to 63. 1863, I can't remember exactly. There was a point where the 7 Years' War spilled into Meissen and destroyed the porcelain factory, destroyed the entire town. Hahnemann's father lost everything, and they became incredibly poor, starvingly poor, like many, many people in that town. Hahnemann's father never really recovered from this. When Hahnemann was 20, he decided that he wanted to be a doc. And so he went to school in Leipzig at a medical school there. And the medical school there taught theory. It would be as if someone handed you a copy of a Materia Medica and Stuart Close's book, The Genius of Homeopathy, and said, go sit down over there and read those books. And when you're done, we'll give you your doctorate. That was it. There was no clinic, no clinic. Did I mention there was no clinic? Doctors graduated having never seen one patient. There were no hospitals. So Hahnemann started and did like 6 months of this and said, this does not make sense to me. Oh, thank you, thank you. Kristen put in a little link here about the sources of homeopathy. If you guys grab that link and follow it, You can find it there. I highly recommend that you get a copy of this. I know that you're busy reading Materia Medica and other things, but this will give you an understanding of homeopathy that's really helpful. So if you pleasure reading, do any of us do pleasure reading? This would be a good thing to put on your list. Okay, so in 1777, Hahnemann went to Vienna. And in Vienna, something incredibly new was happening. In fact, it was called the new medicine, the new approach. And at the modern school of Vienna, they said this thing where you just go sit in a corner and read what they used to do, we're not doing that. The rector was named Joseph von Koren, and he believed that we should teach medicine at the bedside. And so he started the students right there, looking at sick people from the very beginning. It would be like learning through an internship with a doctor. And he emphasized the importance of studying medicines. Now, von Koren was sensitive to in some way, Hahnemann caught his eye. Now, Hahnemann was very bright. He spoke many languages. He was supporting himself barely through school by giving French and German lessons to the other students who flocked from all over Europe. And remember that at that time, a lot of the medical texts were being written in French, German, and English, and mostly coming out of Scotland, Germany, France. And so Hahnemann was teaching the other students and getting money from that to support himself because his family was impoverished. Von Koren noticed that he had no money, that he was having a problem, and introduced him to a local baron who took Hahnemann in, and Hahnemann became this baron's companion and assistant. And this baron took Hahnemann around with him to all of the rest of the aristocracy, and Hahnemann had access to their libraries. And Hahnemann used what he was learning at school to treat them. Now remember that in 1777, therapeutics was still really early on. Their goal was to be at the patient's bedside. Their goal was to understand what medicines were doing, but they were kind of at the beginning of making it up. They didn't really know very much about it. Mostly what they knew in 1777 was this is the method that we must pursue. We must move away from we give this group of things all stirred together in a bucket because that's what we've always done, to when someone has this specific kind of illness, we're going to discover what works with that specific kind of illness. The idea of individualization was what Hahnemann was taught by von Koren and by Anton von Sturck. Okay? Have you guys heard some of this before? Are you familiar with these ideas? Yes, no? Okay, so one of the things that I want to point out, Hahnemann graduated from school, and he didn't actually graduate from the Modern School of Vienna because it was too much money. He transferred to a different school, which had the lowest fees of any place in Germany. And he graduated from there because it was what he could gather the money for and afford. And once he got out of school, he went to work in a little town where he began to work with the local populace, but not very many people at that time were interested. It wasn't really a thing to go to the doctor then. You didn't go to the doctor unless you were dying, because doctors had a really bad reputation for throwing a whole bunch of stuff into a bucket and giving it to you. and for bleeding you and cupping you and feeding you horrible things and attaching leeches. So, as you can imagine, medicine wasn't very popular. People didn't want to go see the doc. And so Hahnemann was not very successful, and he found that even the therapeutics he did know were not very useful. And so he began to translate books as a way of making money. By this time, he had made a good working relationship with a local apothecary whose laboratory he was able to use to do experiments. And then he met the apothecary's stepdaughter, Johanna, who he married. And over the next maybe 20 something years, they had 11 children. They moved continually. Hahnemann was not able to make a living, but he was still fascinated with the methods of identifying what are the properties of various medicines. And how do I eliminate the original disease? And this all came from von Koren and von Sturck. He began to develop his ideas of homeopathy around 1790. And this was when he was translating Cullen's Materia Medica and started his experiments with China, where he took China and he developed fever and chills, and he stopped taking it and they went away. And after this was when he began to publish. And his first version of the Organon was published in 1810. Okay, this era between 1790 and 1810 was 20 years of not really practicing successfully, but really trying to learn. And in this book, there's some really interesting stuff about von Sturck's experiments with stramonium, where they were trying to take substances that were clearly very poisonous and find a way to give them to someone without damaging them. That was everything that we think of now as this potentization process. Hahnemann was not the only one working with these ideas, but he was the one that put it together into a system, which is something that we are very grateful for. So once he had put this together, he published the Organon, very rudimentary ideas, in 1810. And he began to practice using this approach. And he began to teach other docs in Leipzig. Eventually, he got chased out of Leipzig by the apothecaries. Within 20 years, by 1830, homeopathy had spread all through Europe, and it was brought to the US by 1830. Now think about how young this is, guys. It didn't exist at all in 1790. It was first codified in 1810. By 1833, 23 years in, there's already a school in the US. There were already people taking homeopathy to Israel, to Brazil, to Panama, to India. In 1844 was when the first medical association in the US was formed, the American Institute of Homeopathy. Now compare this to Chinese medicine that accumulated knowledge over thousands of years, 2,000 years. And is emerging now into the US. It's spread very, very differently, okay? So there is a dynamism to homeopathy that is part of the feature itself. And we can take that dynamism and tie it right back into this era of its birth, in the era of Enlightenment, which grew out of this morbific influence of decades of war and a desire to do things differently. These are all aligned. Okay, everybody with me so far? Questions about any of that? Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit more. We've got about 25 more minutes, maybe 20 more minutes of content, and then we're going to do Q&A, and then we're going to wrap up for today. So homeopathy spread really quickly out from its area in Allentown to most other states. And there were homeopathic medical boards and medical schools in Kansas, in Iowa, in Michigan, in California, in Philadelphia, in Maine, in Massachusetts, and you can find in the old literature a lot of references to these. In Philadelphia, the Hahnemann Medical School still is called the Hahnemann Medical School, and that's because of Hahnemann. And in Washington, D.C., this statue to Hahnemann is quite near to the White House, and some of you who have gone to the NCH conferences in Reston may have actually gone to visit this. When the Americans for Homeopathy Choice had their Homeopathy on the Hill event, they all met in front of this Hahnemann monument. It's the only statue to a physician or to a non-citizen that is in the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. So, how do we study this? Well, first of all, Hahnemann's book is not philosophy. He is not talking about why. In fact, in the very first aphorism of the Organon, he says, our job is not to spin theories and say why, which is his reaction to his early medical school. It's methodology. And so what we're doing as we study the Organon is building an architecture in our head so that in 6 months or 3 months or 5 years down the road, when you are sitting across from a client or studying a case, the thought of what you need from the wisdom of the Organon will pop up into your mind. This is why you need to study. This is why you need to read the Organon every year. I've been studying homeopathy now, I've been practicing for 25 years. And I've been studying for 32 or 3 years. And there are times when a phrase from the Organon just comes into my mind when I need it. That's what I'm hoping to help all of you guys build. So a lot of us have it sitting on our shelf, but what about actually reading it? What about when we dive in? It is very different than reading a book like this, where we just sit down and read and comprehend. So we need to use techniques that are associated with historical documents. The Organon is what we would call a primary source document, something that was created in a specific circumstance at a specific time, that gives Hahnemann's firsthand account. This is his ideas. And it establishes a frame of reference for something. And Hahnemann creates a lot of notes and cross-references, and we also need to do that when we are studying. And there's that whole vocabulary thing that is honestly very off-putting when you keep running across words where you think, I have no idea what that means. And I definitely have no idea what that means in that sentence, even though I might have an idea somewhere of what that meant in some other way. Okay, so we're gonna run across unfamiliar terms that were characteristic of his era. Things like Sydenham's smooth scarlatina. Anybody seen that? In the introduction with Hahnemann, he goes into his preface and he starts talking about Sydenham's smooth scarlatina. Well, I didn't learn that in school. So we're going to have to get familiar with things that were commonly talked about in Hahnemann's era, medical terms that were part of Hahnemann's era, things that were German ideas, things that were Enlightenment ideas. We're going to run across all of these in the Organon. And so our best ally with the vocabulary is to become familiar with the unfamiliar, which is going to be uncomfortable. And fortunately for all of us, Wenda's book has a great glossary. And so I want to recommend that when you've got a few minutes, read the glossary. Read a word, read its definition, make up a sentence in your own mind of what that is, and practice with those things. The more you go over them, the better you're going to be with interpreting what Hahnemann has to say. And the side benefit of this is that you are going to rock the table in Scrabble, because there's going to be all these weird, unfamiliar words that require strange combinations of vowels and consonants that you are going to be really good at. So I want to introduce a process here of how do we read a historical document. We can't just pick this book up and read it as a textbook, nor should we. So there's a 4-step process, and I will post an article about how do you read a historical document that all of you can reference. Okay, so we're going to read at many different levels, and we're simultaneously going to pay attention to the argument, and with Hahnemann, it's very argumentative. You know, what is the point he's trying to make? What's the purpose of what he's saying? What is the context around it that helps us make sense of it? And then what's the actual content that he's giving us? And is that credible? Should we believe it? Should we not? Should we take it as fact because Hahnemann said it? Or should we challenge it? I can guarantee you if Hahnemann was here and reading it, he would be challenging it. So what's the method we're going to use? I'm going to recommend that we read each piece 4 different ways, ask ourselves different questions about it. So the first thing is to read for origin and context. The second step is to read for meaning. The third step is to read for argument. And the 4th step is to read it like a historian. So we're going to practice that today. So step 1, we're going to start out with the title, with the author, with the place, with the date. And we're going to, at any time you read a document, you should really take the time to open up and read the beginning. Where was Hahnemann when he was writing this? What was he about at that time? So for us, reading the 6th edition of the Organon, he was in his wisest state. He was the toast of the town. For the first time in his life, he had no financial worries. He was married to a wealthy Parisian aristocrat elite. He had been given a prestigious award for stopping a typhoid epidemic that was unfolding in France when Napoleon's soldiers came home. He was in an amazing creative period where he was able to reflect back on everything that he had done. We are seeing the culmination of many different ideas. And so the Organon, as it comes to us in the 6th edition, is quite a sophisticated architecture of thought. Very different than when you read the 1st edition of the Organon. So you also want to look at, for any historical document where you're looking at the origin, what are the document's footnotes? What are the bibliographic references? Now, Hahnemann has these scattered throughout in his footnotes where he says, in Hoeflin's journal of blah, blah, blah. Think about those and try and track some of those down. This is do some of you guys know Jamie Oskin and some of his teaching? He's brilliant. He loves these old sources and he tracks this stuff down and reads it. We can learn so much from looking at these old sources. So what's the purpose of the origin and context? Our first read is to look at the document's origin to get a sense of its meaning. This book is Hahnemann's prayer. This is how he describes it in some of his letters and lesser writings. This is his prayer for the health of humanity, suffering humanity. And it was an amazing work for him. And so as we approach it, I try to kind of limit my irritation at his ranting by understanding that that was the way people communicated then, and that this book was written as the desire of his heart to heal the ills of humanity. If you can keep that in mind, it might be slightly less annoying. So as you open up your Organon, and as you begin to read any individual part of it, I want you to ask yourself, what does this specific information that I'm reading, and all through the preface, he's giving all kinds of information. What does it suggest about the document? All that ranting at the beginning, what it suggests about the document is that Hahnemann is trying to break an old mold, the pre-Enlightenment era of medicine, and present a new enlightened, what he saw as an enlightened method of healing, an enlightened system that was based on the patient's bedside and individual qualities of medicines. How does each part of the sourcing of where Hahnemann was living when he was reading this, of the place and what was happening, of the era, of when different things came into the Organon, how does that impact me as I read and understand the document? That's why this and other books, David Little's books, his writings, which I'll introduce later on in this series, are really useful to us in helping us to do this origin and context assessment of what's going on. Oh, thank you. Yes, we have a comment in here saying, I actually love his passion. Yes, Hahnemann's incredibly passionate about what he's doing. All right, as you're looking at his writings in the Organon, we want to ask ourselves, why does this matter? Why does this section of the Organon matter? Why is this author significant? What about the date and time was significant? And as we're understanding now, homeopathy is still an encapsulation of the Enlightenment, and it's still embattled. It's still dealing with the religious oppression backlash. It's still dealing with the scientific bioreductionism. Still, we're still in Hahnemann's encapsulated dilemma. Does the location of where it was written suggest anything about the document? What background information do I already know about the document that helps me? As you begin to sit down and read, I want you to think about these things. Ask yourself these questions. What do we know about medicine in 1810? Why was the author prompted to produce this document? And what factual information is there in the source document? Is it still current? Is it still true? We know that Hahnemann was writing this before germ theory. We know that he wrote chronic diseases before an understanding of germ theory was clear. Can the factual information in here be verified by other documents? Well, that's why Hahnemann's in there quoting Hoeflin's journal and other important references. And then we get into a really interesting thing. What opinions are presented in the document? Many of us, and this certainly has been true for me, have a reaction to Hahnemann's opinions. I read it thinking, what a jerk this guy is. What an unbelievable jerk. And then I got to the point where I was reading it, even, by the time you get 10 pages into the preface, you're like, Hahnemann, I've heard it. Yes. Do you have anything useful to say? Can you tell me something new? Yes, I understand you didn't like medicine at that time. Can we move on? Why did Hahnemann hold so strongly these opinions? And why does he go on and on and on? Why does he say those things so many times? What do you think? What was motivating the author? Can you share his opinion? Do we sometimes have similar opinions about the medicine of our day? Do we find his arguments to be compelling, or do we just react to them because they're unpleasant? In our day of political correctness, we see him as bombastic and obnoxious. So we need to get over that and look at this in its historical context, which allows us to hold that as, oh, yes, there's Hahnemann being Hahnemann. And if he were living today, he might describe it differently, or he might not. And what is implied in this document that might not be overtly stated? Hahnemann's passion, Hahnemann's love. I would really recommend for any of you that you get a copy of the book Hahnemann's Lesser Writings. When I first was studying homeopathy, I read Chronic Diseases and I read the Organon, and I read both of them multiple times, and my conclusion was that he was just a jerk, that he was a misanthropic jerk. He was brilliant, and he came up with amazing stuff, but personality style, he was just problematic. And maybe he had to be that way for homeopathy to come through him. Fine, I don't judge that, but I can observe that that's my perception of it. If I saw him today, I would say this behavior is jerky behavior. And we can also say he was, in his lesser writings, we see him talk about how much he loved little children and how much it broke his heart to see them sick and dying, and why he was motivated to stay up all night studying, doing experiments, understanding the qualities of medicine, because if that could help one little child that was sick to be well, then he didn't care how much sleep he lost. And I think the first time that I read him talking about how much he loved little children, I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This bombastic guy who rants all the time? This seems out of character. But when you read his lesser writings, you begin to see how rounded he was, and how this implication of how passionately he wanted people to be well comes through. Okay? So step 2, we're looking for meaning. What does it mean? First thing, we've got origin and context. Step 2, meaning. So this little paragraph here is from Hahnemann's earliest writing, where he begins to talk about the roots of homeopathy, which is going to come to be. And he published this essay on a new principle for ascertaining the curative powers of drugs in 1796. So this is the method that I'm going to show you of reading for meaning. You want to read the section of text to see what does it mean, and then try to underline the main idea. And I just apologize in advance to anybody who says I don't write in books. I write in all my books. I scribble in my books. And there's a whole school of archivist study called marginalia, where you just study what's written in the margins of famous books. So I imagine that someday all of you will have some archivist will look at your books as famous homeopaths who contributed to the world good and read your marginalia. Okay? When you're doing your first reading for meaning, skip over anything you don't understand. Just read the words you do understand and try to get information out of it. So let's all try this together. So we're just going to look at this one paragraph. Signs of its good quality. I wonder what we're talking about here. Signs of its good quality. Indicators that I can assess when something's good. Maybe that's what we're talking about. The ancient physicians selected for employment those fibers of roots that were moderately rigid. Oh, okay, so we appear to be talking about plants, the ancient physicians. So in the past, the old docs, they selected for employment. They used those fibers of the roots, plant materials of the root, that were moderately rigid. So they had to be strong. Friable, gosh, maybe I don't know what that word is, I'm skipping it. Soon causing sneezing when brought near the nose. Oh, that's interesting. So they grabbed a plant, got its roots, stuck it to their nose and said, oh, it makes me sneeze. Was that a good thing? Was it a bad thing? I don't know. Looks like he's got a footnote here. I guess I'll check that out later. They had to be fleshy. Oh, the roots had to be rigid and fleshy, of equal thickness throughout. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, we were trying to find fibers of equal thickness, and they rejected those that were too pointed. Oh, all right. If there were root fibers that were pointy, I wonder why those were bad. I don't know. Like the fibrils of a rush. Okay, I don't know what fibrils are. A rush, maybe that's cattails, maybe not. I don't know. And from which, when broken, dust escaped. For this was a sign that the root was too old. Oh, okay. So it looks like they're trying to get things that are fresh and not old. They ought to have a narrow medulla and taste moderately hot. Oh my. Okay, I don't know what a narrow medulla is. I suppose I can go look those words up. And taste moderately hot. So what's the underlying idea here? What would you underline in this paragraph if you were trying to get the main idea? What should we underline? Tis your cue. Any suggestions? You can find the chat in the bottom bar of your panel, your presentation panel. Fibers, roots, right. So we're talking about roots, good. Moderately rigid, good. Equal thickness, excellent. We could maybe underline selected for employment. What it is that we're going to choose and the qualities of what we're choosing. Rejected, too pointed. Yep, what are we getting out? Maybe dusty. We could underline dust too, because we don't want that either. Okay, and taste moderately hot. These people pulled out these roots and stuck them on their tongue. Yeah, okay. So this is evidently a paragraph of how do I assess whether a plant is something I want to use or not. And in this book, Essay on a New Principle for Ascertaining the Curative Powers of Drugs, maybe this is how I choose what I'm going to make the drug out of. Now, I don't have the whole document here, but we can see, and then we can underline what is it that we're trying to find out. We skipped over the words we didn't understand. We underlined the main idea, okay? So we have the context and origin. Great. So Salo says, what's this about? It's how to select a root of good quality. So we have gathered our understanding of this. Now let's go into argument. The first step, origin and context. Second step, we're just trying to say, what does it say? Third step, reread the same text again. And we say, how is the argument presented by the reader? What's the point that the author is trying to present to the reader, not by the reader, sorry. What evidence or examples are given to support or give credulity to the author's argument? Like in this guy, where he says, or when broken dust escaped, for this was a sign that the root was old. He's giving us an explanation here. That's an example of this, something that gives support to their point. And if there's something that the person is saying that proves their point, what's the supportive data? Underline that or note in the margin. Is the argument logical or believable? I think this is logical. Does it look logical to you? Does it look believable to you that you would want to make a drug out of a healthy, good quality root? That kind of makes sense to us, doesn't it? Okay. And then we have to ask ourselves, does this text dispute or contradict other known references? Remember about our biases, about health, about medicine, about material sources of infection. We're going to read things in the Organon that run smack into our biases. And we're going to read some things that we know aren't true. Hahnemann's going to make comments about electricity, about germs, about whatever, because he's a man of his era, and this book was last updated in the 1860s. But I swear if he were alive now, he would have brought out the 2020 version and corrected all those things. Okay, so reading number 4. Reread the passage of the text one more time like a historian. Now we're gathering the origin and context, the meaning, the quality of the thinking, the argument and point made by the author. Given this author's viewpoint, what bias or perspective is being presented with this statement and argument? How is our understanding shaped by what this person has had to say? How was this text received at the time? Well, honestly, none of Hahnemann's writings were very well received. And we could say, oh, well, the people who were outside the homeopathic community didn't like them. You know what? The people inside the homeopathic community didn't like them. When I was in Paris a few years ago, I met with Dr. Olivia Raban, who is a homeopath, who is the curate for the homeopathic library at l'Hôpital Saint-Jacques. And he helped me doing my research on what was the homeopathic community's response to chronic diseases, which was published in 1828. And it was divided into 2 groups. There were Hahnemann's loyal men. Sorry, they really were all men at that point. And Hahnemann said, if you disagree with me by so much as a straw's breadth, a hair's breadth, then you are out and I will not speak to you ever again. And this happened a lot. He was not flexible and he was not into critical thinking about his work, except for himself. He would do it, but nobody else could introduce critical thinking ideas. So the homeopathic community's response was the loyal men all said, yes, and that's all. Dot says, unfortunately, we still kind of have this attitude in the homeopathic world. Yeah, we all live within the Hahnemannian miasm, guys. And then there were the critical thinkers, and most of them did not write very much about chronic diseases in a critical thinking way until Hahnemann died. And after he died, there was a lot more that was written about it. And for the most part, the homeopathic community hated it. They did not like the book. It did not make sense. They didn't understand Sora. They did not understand or agree with the idea of miasms. And so this is, you know, when Hahnemann told Melanie, this latest edition of the Organon, hang on to that because they're not ready and they're not going to like it. It was true. And it included, there was a question earlier about Q potencies, which we're going to go into in a lot of detail in one of our later sessions. Hahnemann developed this incredibly sophisticated tool, and yet there are an awful lot of homeopaths. He saw it as the highest and most effective way. And there are a lot of homeopaths who never use LMs. They never use Q potencies, which doesn't make them bad. It just means that this is something that Hahnemann used that has not really been taken up that well by the homeopathic community. And maybe that's because it's hard to have a whole community of mutineers. And I think that's the reality. A lot of us come to homeopathy either because we saw it work in such a compelling way that we could not turn away, or we were called to it, or it made sense to us. But many of us are mutineers in comparison to dominant paradigms in society. Otherwise, we wouldn't be aligned with homeopathy. And that is what Hahnemann was as well. So it's kind of hard to corral a whole profession of mutineers and get them all on the same page. Our advantage about that is that when we read the Organon, we want to read it like a mutineer. We want to look at all of the information that Hahnemann gives us. Yes, most of the homeopathic community works from the 4th or maybe the 5th edition of the Organon. Kent never saw the 6th edition of the Organon. He died before he was able to study and work with that. Okay? So we should be asking ourselves, how does this text sit? How does it sit within the professional community where it was distributed? Does the author present some things and not others? Are there unanswered questions? These are the questions that historians should be asking, and we should ask them too. So this is the invitation, guys. Begin this journey with me. Between now and the end of the year, we are going to journey through the Organon together. And I want you to practice this method. And please, between now and the next time we meet, I want to invite you to read the introduction and the preface, that beginning part, everything up to aphorism number 1, and read it in these 4 ways. Read for origin and context. Read for meaning. Scribble in the margins. Read for argument. Is Hahnemann case building here? Is he really making his point? Is he convincing you? Is he referring you to other reference articles that you can find that really do uphold his point of view? What's your historical assessment? Okay?